as having survived the Holocaust. I do understand that, first of all, can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. If it gets so that you can't, let me know, please. I know that some of you have heard survivors of the Holocaust speak before. I think Deb Rocco was here sometime fairly recently, and Annika Bloomfield, and I know both of those people. Deborah doesn't live in Portland, but we are a speakers bureau that she's part of. So we do know each other, and I want to tell you that our stories encompass the same event, of course, but each story is a little bit different. So Deb speaks of her mother's story, Aileen, I don't know if you met her, whose story is in its own way also pretty horrific. And then Annika's story is again different from Aileen's and different from mine. So I am, and she saw to it, I'm sure she didn't do it herself, but her people saw to it that my grandfather got what was called an honorary chair, like the chairmanship of a department, an honorary chair which was for foreign, being non-Belgian scientists, to teach for a year in Brussels at the university. She saw to it that he got it. The other thing he had to do, besides having a place to go, was they demanded the Nobel money. He had left it in Sweden in the bank, and he had to see to it that the money got to the Nazis in Austria. Now, we're talking before computers here. I'm never quite sure how to make that statement because I know you've been born into a world with computers and you're comfortable using them and they're part of your life. Didn't exist. It just wasn't there. You didn't even do a lot of long-distance phone calling. If you got a long-distance phone call in those days, either somebody had died or your bank had gone belly up. It was a big, big deal. So he had to do it by writing letters and whatnot. It took 10 weeks. So they were in prison for 10 weeks, not tortured, you know, still treated moderately decently. And when the Nobel money arrived at the Nazi bank in Graz, they did let them go. They released them from prison. They had to be out of the country in 2 months. Easier said than done. You didn't just click a computer, make a plane reservation, and fly out. There were planes, they were for military use, and they dropped out of the sky with fair regularity. It wasn't something you'd really want to do. And you had to pay this kind of tax and that kind of tax. Most Jews who escaped absolutely penniless because the Nazis took it all first. You also had to get not one visa. There are countries in the world today where if you or I were going to travel there, we'd need a visa, and it would be a 3-month visa or a 6-month or a student visa or whatever. There are people coming to this country who need visas also. In those days, it was very, very, very difficult for Jews to get a visa in the first place. And in the second place, you had to get, for example, for my grandfather, he had to get a visa out of Austria, a visa across the border into, I'm going to assume he went through Switzerland, I don't know that part of the story, into Switzerland, across Switzerland, out of Switzerland, and into the next country, which would have been Belgium. So in his case at that moment, 5 separate visas. And there were Jews, far too many of them, and my father now, not my grandfather, knew several people who in the end were caught and deported because they were in that time period of trying to get the visas to match up, and one of them would have expired before another one had come in. I mean, to me, that always felt like you were murdered because you had a book overdue at the library. You couldn't get it in on time. It's a horrific sense of tension to try to get that all in place and then also to not have it work. But because he had the chair in Belgium, the visas were somewhat easier. And he did get them, and he went to Belgium while he was, this is now my grandfather, right, the Nobel Prize winner. While he was there, he was invited to England to the lab of the person who had shared the Nobel Prize with him, Sir Henry. So then again, when his chairmanship was over, the visas opened up a little more easily because he had basically a sponsor in a way. So he was in England for 5 months, and then New York University, NYU, offered him a position. So, I mean, there was a bit of a scramble of how he was going to get the money to cross the ocean, but he arrived here. My grandmother, his wife, on the other hand, thank you, was in Austria, and there was a branch of her family that was Italian, and there's Italy, right? And they owned some property in Trieste, which is nice enough to be right on this map here. It's right where the old Yugoslavia and Italy meet. And there was some property there. I've heard it was an apartment building. I've heard it was a few apartment buildings. It was something. The Italians had it, and the Nazis wanted it. And the Italians, even though they were both Axis countries, both on the same side of World War II, the Italians weren't giving it up. And my grandmother got caught in those crosshairs. So my grandfather had to get out, and my grandmother couldn't get out. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her, because in some ways she's sort of part of my story. My grandmother was an only child. She was 17 when she married my grandfather, who was 10 to 12 years older than she. And she had not gone to school. She had been what we now call homeschooled. So she was very smart. She was very well educated. She knew a whole lot about a whole lot. But what she didn't have were street smarts. How are you going to get street smarts with that kind of protected upbringing? So she had married the professor. She was the Frau Professor. They had their 4 children. They had a governess, a gardener, and a cook, which was not all that unusual for the middle class at that time. So she knew how to manage a household, but she herself didn't know how to cook, and I'm sure she didn't know how to garden either. And so here she was suddenly, still with a house, but no husband, no income. Her children were not at home anymore, so there was no governess. There was probably a gardener who had to leave because he or she, probably he, would have been at risk working for Jews. And there she was alone with nothing. And what she did was so clever that I sometimes tell this story because in a way she was really in the shadow of my grandfather. She was sort of the power behind the throne, but she was, in my mind, never really recognized for who she was. So every once in a while I talk about her as a way of recognizing her. In those days, everybody didn't have a car. The roads were too small, the cars were too expensive. That's not how you got around. There were trains, there were buses, there were trams, etc. And there was also a company you could call, excuse me, and say, I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow at 2, and I'd like you to pick me up at 1:30, and then we'll come home. And they would do that, and then at the end of the month, you got a bill, like you get an electric bill or a phone bill or a utility bill. She called them because somebody, and I don't know what kind of somebody it might have been, risked their own life to go to the house and tell my grandmother, do not be here tonight, something's going to happen. That's what she knew. And so she wasn't, and what she did was to call this car company and tell them, I want to go to Vienna, which is up north in Austria, which is small, and I want to leave at 6 o'clock. She herself didn't know what was going to happen. She was just told something was. So nowadays, to go from Graz to Vienna, there's an Autobahn, which we know as freeways. It takes 2.5 hours. But at that time, there were no Autobahns, and Austria has much of the Alps in it. It's a mountainous country. She was on the road between Graz and Vienna for 6 hours while Kristallnacht was happening, you know, the night of the broken glass. Okay. And I just think that's genius. I'm just very impressed with somebody as narrowly raised as she was would have thought to do that. She had a very difficult 2 years at Vienna that she didn't talk about. There was one hotel who allowed Jews, and she didn't eat a lot because she didn't have any money. And the Viennese and also some of the French are a very, very polite society. Sometimes it's just surface, but they're very polite. And they would invite her to what the British call tea or high tea. So she'd have little cakes and she'd have coffee. But she very rarely had a decent meal because nobody thought to invite her for a meal. And at one point somebody did, and she didn't have the car fare to get there. So that's the level to which things and she had dropped. So back to us then. She did ultimately get out, and nobody in the family knows quite how, because she really didn't talk about those 2 years. I know there was some correspondence about whether she'd go around through Russia to China and Japan or risk the Atlantic, and I think she risked the Atlantic, and she did make it not very long before we did. Okay, so back to my family. We got out of where I was born when I was just a few months old because Hitler was coming, and you know that he marched in. And so we went to Prague. Easier said than done. My father was born and raised in Prague. He could just go in. My mother, I told you, was born and raised in Austria. She couldn't go in as a Jew. And I was not born in Prague either. So I was, as a Jew, not allowed in, okay? Now, I'm a baby, right? So, and of course, the whole thing about Jews not being able to travel and not being able to go into here or out of there or whatever, and being altogether marked for annihilation, you know, what was our big crime? Was being Jewish. It was the only reason that we were marked for being annihilated, and we very nearly were. So my father went to Prague. My mother, when you're in flight, you don't usually take your furniture and stuff with you. You sort of just leave. My mother took some furniture and rented a truck, not a moving van as we know it now, something probably more like FedEx or UPS size truck. Had the furniture loaded in the truck, and she hid under the furniture. The driver of the truck knew that he was taking a load of furniture into Prague. He did not know that there was anybody on board. And, you know, they went, and it was one of a few pieces of what I can only call luck or good fortune, that on that day, at that time, that truck was not inspected. It was waved through. Had it been inspected, she would have been deported, and I would have had either no mother or a different mother. And then it wasn't that difficult to get me into Prague because I was well under a year old. I was about 5 months, I think, or 6. And my mother, being Austrian, didn't speak Czech. So she married my father obviously, and was taking private Czech lessons. And her Czech teacher was from Prague and took me in as her baby. So I lived as her baby for a week until my mother and father got in. So that's how we got into Prague. And then, of course, again, my father's pessimism, we really had to get out of Czechoslovakia because nobody who knew anything about anything really thought that Hitler was going to come in and take just the Bohemian part of Czechoslovakia and leave the rest alone. I mean, it was clear that he was going to take as much of Europe as he can, and getting a foothold into one country was just about as good as having taken that whole country. So he knew what was coming down that pike. Enter again the Queen of Belgium. I don't know who contacted, whatever, but the Queen got us a visa into Belgium where we could be for 3 months. I don't know what the 3 months was about, whether she was under pressure not to allow Jews or how that all went. My parents didn't really know that either, and they didn't talk much about it. And so we had to have a visa out. And one of the things in my life that just every once in a while, it doesn't raise hackles exactly, but it's just something I'm never going to know, and I'm an information junkie, so it's not so wonderful not to know. There is a country that granted us a visa on the condition that we never use it. And again, you're welcome to ask whatever question you want. There are going to be some questions I can't answer, and that's one of them. I don't know how that worked, how that came about. More importantly to me is that I don't know which country that was, and neither did my parents. I know that we went into Belgium, and having this exit possibility permitted that. I have had the good fortune of traveling a lot in my adult life. I have no idea if I've been to that country, not been to that country. I've certainly never thanked anybody, and they saved my life at that juncture. So it's one of those things that happens, and my parents died not knowing, and I'm going to die not knowing. So I just sort of do a general thank you and hope it somehow energetically reaches the right people. So we were in Belgium for 3 months. And then we did go to France. I don't know the technicalities of, we obviously got the visas, and I don't know the rest of how come France. And originally we were in the north of France, and then the bombs started dropping, both the German bombs, but also the American bombs trying to get to the Germans. And so we moved down towards central France, and if any of you have seen any of the World War II movies where, there are trains just jammed twice and 3 times as full as it can hold of people and being shrapneled, and, the kind of older World War II movies, that was the scene, particularly in Paris. Paris was so crowded with Jews trying to leave. And Paris has more than one railway station, and it did at that time too, that the buses between the stations were no longer charging. You could just get off your train, get onto a bus to the next station to continue your trip. And it was really that kind of train. You didn't know if you were going to be bombed out while you were on it. And something that's true of almost every child of a certain age, I don't know, between 5 and 8 or whatever age it might be, we get really angry at our parents, and we have some kind of story that they couldn't possibly be our parents because our parents would be nicer or better or whatever it was that we were unhappy with. I think every child in the world goes through that at some time or other. And my version of that story was that my mother had told me that especially in Paris, there were children that got separated from their parents just in the rush to get onto the trains, There were parents who left their children because they didn't know what else to do in that kind of madness and crush. And my mother, who also didn't speak very much about the whole first 3 years of my life in Europe, you know, made it clear to me that they weren't going to leave me behind, and that, you know, they had successfully, all three of us, gotten on the train. And my version of the story, when I was angry at my parents, however old I was, and that they weren't really my parents, is that actually they had picked up the wrong child. I looked so much like my father that there's no way in the world that they picked up the wrong child, but that took me another few years, not to realize as much as to accept. So a little bit of normalcy in a very abnormal early lifetime. So we were in in central France, and eventually we went to southern France to get out. The only way you could get out was at a seacoast because it had to be by ship. And, whoops. And my parents, like many people, had wanted actually to go to cross here the Pyrenees Mountains. They're fairly high. To cross the Pyrenees, through Spain to go to Portugal, because as you can see, Portugal is almost all seacoast, had many more ships than anywhere else leaving. But again, the visa issue, and my parents figured out it just wasn't going to happen that way, and it was too risky to start it and try to make it happen. So we went to Marseille, which, it surprises me, is not on this map, but it's roughly where the O of the word Andorra is. It's a seaport, a very busy one, and we went there, and every Jew who wasn't in Paris trying to get out was in Marseille for the same reason we were. It was an absolutely clogged city. And we got there on a Friday. And the short version of the story, I don't see it. Yeah. Is that we got out on a Monday, but we almost didn't, because on Friday, they were allowing only men on the ship. By Saturday, maybe women, but certainly not children. And again, there are some people in such a panic who would have left them. By Monday, they were allowing children, and so my parents agreed to get on the ship. They were glad to. It was a cargo ship, 250 families in the hold, and it took a month. And it did not come right to the United States. And my mother always said, the one time she talked about it, said that the shipping companies would delay in the Caribbean, which we did spend a month there, until everybody's money ran out, and then a ship would appear. Maybe she was right, but she had a certain amount of cynicism about her, and maybe she wasn't right. I don't know. But in any case, we did get out. We were in Santo Domingo for a month. In a camp, it wasn't a concentration camp. I mean, we weren't brutalized or tortured. And actually, Santo Domingo was the only country at the time that was freely allowing Jews. And I know some survivors who spent 5 years there. Oh, thank you. Okay, so here's Santo Domingo. We were there for 4 weeks. The ocean was your recreation, it was your shower, it was your toilet, it was your cooking water, it was, okay, so this was a camp. It did have beds, but it was refugee living. And then about a month later, there was a ship that came, I think it was Port-au-Prince, we had to go to Haiti. And then all of a sudden we were on a cruise ship, where there were dining rooms and food and all this stuff that we hadn't known for 3 years. And a lot of people got sick. If you're starved for a while and then you eat too much too soon, it makes you pretty sick. So there are a number of stories to tell about how this all happened. One of you that I'll tell you was when we were in France, we were also waiting for some money for the passage. You had to have a sponsor, which we did. It's somebody we had never met. They didn't know us at all, but they did know my grandfather was another scientist who agreed to sponsor us, which meant that he took the risk that if we didn't become self-supporting, he would have to support us. So he was quite the hero in my life. We were living in central, well, it's on the other map, in central France, and got word somehow that the money was there. And it had to be decided whether my mother or my father was going to go pick it up, because Jews were not allowed to cross. France is divided into départements the way we are divided into states, or the way a state is divided into a country. And Jews were not allowed to cross from one into the other of those. But sometimes you had to. I know my father once said their dentist was in the next one, and they had to go. So the money was where they had to be illegal to get it. And they had to decide, and I know you guys, I hope you guys are not yet parents, but you will be sometime. The decisions you sometimes have to make as a parent just knocks your socks off. They had to decide which one would go on the basis of what would happen to me if they didn't get back, if they got caught traveling where they weren't supposed to. And they decided in the end that my mother would go, because in those days it was a whole lot easier for a man to support a family than it was for a woman. Women didn't usually work outside the home, they ran the home. And they didn't earn money, and they were totally dependent on their husbands. And they were afraid that if my father went and didn't come back, my mother would be sort of left with nothing. So my mother, having grown up with 3 brothers, was afraid of very little. And so how did she do that? She took a night train, for one thing, because they weren't patrolled as often. And then she arrived, again, this was a Friday, and for those of you who don't know, the Jewish holy day or Sabbath or whatever you'd like to call it begins, the weekly one. The holy day is Saturday, that's our Sabbath, but it begins at sundown on Friday and goes to sundown on Saturday. So Friday, usually offices and things like that close earlier. They're open, but they close earlier in the afternoon. So she arrived on a Friday and had to get from the station to the office without being caught and picked up. So what did she do? My fearless mother, my atheist Jewish fearless mother, went from one Catholic church to the next along the route to the office that had the money. In those days, in Europe, and I think in the United States too, churches and synagogues and houses of worship were open 24/7. They didn't lock at night. You could go in. So that part wasn't so unusual. But she spent from 4 in the morning until 9 in the morning going from one church to the next. And she did tell me that if anybody, the priest himself or anybody else, came in, she was on her knees. And you have to have known my mother to know what a picture that makes. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, except that it saved us. She went to the office and they said they didn't have the money, which always gets me because this was a Jewish organization designed to help Jewish people, and they said the money hadn't arrived. I don't know how she knew that it had, but she decided, all 5'2" of her, that she wasn't leaving the office without it. And so she sat in a chair that must have been similar to what you're sitting on, because she talked about wrapping her legs around the legs of the chair. And she just sat on that Friday in the office. She didn't eat, she didn't drink, she didn't go to the bathroom. I don't think she probably talked to anybody, I don't know. Now, the French, as I said when I was talking also about the Viennese, are very polite. Two of them could have lifted up the chair with her in it and put it outside. They didn't do that. And so as it came close to 2 o'clock and time to close on Friday, you want to guess what happened? They found the money. Whoever just said that. All of a sudden. So she did that, and then of course she had to get back to the station. And again, we were lucky. I don't know why we were lucky twice. We didn't deserve it more than anyone who wasn't lucky. But we had the money and we could go. And so the rest of the story is that we did come to New York. I went all the way through school, from first grade through high school in New York, and then I went to the wild and woolly west of Ohio to college. And have been married, have been divorced. I have 3 daughters, I have 2 grandchildren. And there's a whole lot more. So that's 11 o'clock, is that right?
So if you need to leave for lunch, please do so quietly.
It's going to be a while.
Sorry about that.
So no questions.
So we'll stay.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Someone's had to know before she'll be out.
Yeah, but thank you so much. We still got some time that we can talk about. So.
Okay, so are there any questions? I realize now I should have asked for questions a long time ago.
Clark,
I didn't.
will you close that door so we'll clean up?
Yeah, well,
Are you gonna let them off this?
so are there questions among you about what did or didn't happen or what happens next?
Do your parents, did they describe how they were feeling? What are their feelings during all of this happening?
My parents did not describe feelings. They didn't really allow feelings. And I think partly just that's who they were, but partly it would have been overwhelming at a time when, in their early 30s, they had to start all over again. We arrived in this country massively in debt for our lives, which we ultimately, I mean, not I, but ultimately did pay back, but it meant that we had no money to spend on much of anything else. My father was a chemist, so he was lucky enough to find a job eventually. But feelings were to be squelched, which also has an effect. I'm not very good with expressing feelings either, partly for lack of modeling and partly for lack of permission. I've had to learn to feel my feelings, but I'm still not very good at expressing them. And they just did what they had to do. My mother did work, as did my father. And yeah, so, and that's part of the effect. You know, there are a lot of effects of a history like that. They're a little bit different if you were old enough to remember than if you weren't old enough to remember, but it was just around you. It's not a surprise to me, for example, the first memory, which is my own, is something that I was terrified by. And I've put myself down for most of my life for being such an easily fearful person. But the reality is that I was born into a world that didn't want me. I mean, child survivors are very clear about we are the children who never were children, because you don't have a childhood under that kind of circumstance, and that we're not supposed to be here. And in a way, I sort of speak for the people who can't, the children who never made it and couldn't. And one of the things about these conferences that we have is the big draw for me, and the reason that I've gone to as many of them as I have, because they do get a little bit repetitive in some ways, is that, and this is 1995, so I can't figure that fast, but I was, what, 57 or some such age. It was the first time that I actually felt what people meant when they said they felt safe, and that I had never really felt safe. And the safety, of course, was that it was a somewhat shared history, and you didn't have to explain yourself and what you were feeling and what you were doing, because they got it, because they had their own version of it. Safety has been a huge issue in my life, and I work very hard at not being what I understand is called a helicopter mother. You know, overprotect. I think I did okay with that. They seem to be okay in that way. But I was very aware of that because my world was not safe. And underlying, that's still the case. You don't really get rid of the triggers, is what I've discovered. You can learn, and I've worked on it, and I've worked very hard on it, you can learn how you manage the triggers when they show themselves. So I don't run around now sort of always looking over my back or over my shoulder, or you know, being absolutely scared of everything. But if something comes up, I immediately see the risks. And then have, you know, I go to a movie theater or a theater, before I even sit down, I know where all the exits are. And I'm an aisle sitter. You can talk to Joe about that because we both like to sit in the aisle, and there's only one aisle seat per row. And I usually get it. And, you know, from here on up, I know it's kind of silly, the likelihood of a fire or a whatever other disaster in a movie theater at any given time, or a concert venue, well, now we know better, but even that was outside. But, you know, my head knows that the likelihood isn't high. The rest of me needs to know I can get out. And that I can get out without pushing somebody else out of the way so they don't get out, because I couldn't live with that guilt either. So it's complex, and it's silly, and it's real, and it can be managed, but it can't be gotten rid of. It can be managed. So I don't know. Yes?
Did your parents or you ever go back to Europe to?
Oh, my parents went back to Europe. My father to Czechoslovakia, both of them to Austria. They would not go to Germany.